quantum biology is the idea that we have to understand our body on a slightly smaller scale than I think what we typically think of. So, I tell people that our body is made up of a bunch of organs, and each organ is made up of a bunch of cells, and each cell, organizes a bunch of proteins, and each protein is made up of a bunch of molecules, and each molecule is made up of a bunch of atoms. And then these atoms are actually made up of basically what we thought of maybe somewhere in grade school, right? We learned electron, proton, and neutron. And maybe that's all we did. We learned it at some point back in the day in our schooling, and we forgot about it. But we have to recognize that we're made up of those little tiny particles, and they're called subatomic particles. And that's the quantum level of talking about how to influence those particles so that they make better molecules and better proteins and cells and tissues and organs, and ultimately a better body. So that's the quantum biology.
Brilliant. And it kind of, I think it's intuitive, because a lot of practitioners who aren't aware of quantum biology are saying the same thing, but they're just starting higher up the ladder. They're
Exactly.
talking about, let's say, cellular health impacting organ health, impacting system health, impacting organism health. So it's just a natural evolution in some ways into kind of that next layer. And then before I forget, sort of circadian biology, just in case we don't have anyone, or if we do have people that don't yet understand that term, what are we kind of referring to here?
That's this idea that our body does things in a typical, repeatable fashion within a 24-hour day. And so if we think about the complexity of our bodies, every single cell has 100,000 tasks. It has to organize every single second, which is astronomical to think of. And so there has to be some governing signal that helps to tell which cells what to do when. And if there wasn't, that would be chaos, right? And chaos at that cellular level, that's synonymous with inflammation. It's synonymous with a dysfunctional cell, a cell that's not operating at its best. And so every living creature has had really one main thing that they've been able to kind of tune their day to, and that's the length of daylight and a period of darkness. And so that's what the circadian rhythm really is. We've optimized certain functions to happen throughout the 24-hour clock during the day, and then also at night. And that way we prioritize things that we could accomplish during the day. Like, for example, it would make the most sense for my digestion to be awake and alert and active during the day, as opposed to in the middle of the night when my body needs to repair itself and, encode my memories from short-term storage to long-term recall. So the body has decided what needs to be done within a 24-hour clock, and that's my circadian rhythm.
Perfect. And yeah, I guess the research coming out around that is just exploding, really. I was delivering a webinar on GERD or reflux yesterday, and kind of looking at some of the research around circadian biology, melatonin, and the roles that they play within this. You quickly appreciate just how important it is, even to conditions that you might not initially think would have any sort of connection to it. So the fact that you mentioned the gut as an example there is interesting straight away.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, we think about digestion of food, that's like one of the most energy draining tasks. They realize it, but to digest, not only to acquire it, like acquiring it's easy these days. Back in the day, it was probably a little harder. But in order to acquire food and then digest it and extract all the nutrients, that takes so much time and energy. And so we want to then be able to do that in conjunction with when our digestive juices are at their strongest. And we're actually able to move the food through the gut in an appropriate timeline so that we can extract those nutrients. And so all of that just ties into what's happening with our light environment outside, and then with the darkness at night.
Okay. And these are kind of called, if I pronounce it correctly, Zeitgeists in the research, right?
Zeitgeibers, yeah.
Zeitgeibers. And then we have kind of nutrition, and I think movement to kind of almost secondary level stimuli for this kind of circadian rhythm.
Yeah, absolutely. So the number one signal is the light that we put into our eyes. There's a direct connection. So that's the primary Zeitgeist. There's a direct connection between the eye and the brain. There's literally a little pathway, a little road that connects them. And so any light that enters our eyes, automatically that gets communicated a certain message to the middle of my brain. And in the middle of my brain, there's this master clock that keeps track of everything, called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And it like vibrates, and it literally oscillates and vibrates a certain message that then moves through my body via my water, the water in my body, that then communicates what time of day it is to every single cell. We can enhance that Zeitgeist signaling with when we eat and when we move, or we can actually create like some disharmony. So for example, I have the Zeitgeist that it's first thing in the morning, and my body wants to do X, Y, and Z. And then instead I'm going to turn the temperature way down cold and try to go to bed. It's a very disjointed thing with my body. Instead, my body would expect a colder temperature at night as the day is ending. So temperature is the Zeitgeist, and then I would get into sleep. Food would be the same thing. If I wake up at midnight when my eyes perceive darkness, and then all of a sudden I decide to eat a large meal, that would be creating disharmony with my circadian rhythm based on the timing of when I do certain things.
Perfect. Okay. So coming back to the kind of quantum biology, am I right in saying that when we're on this topic, there is this kind of analogy of the three-legged stool, or I heard Dr. Cruz talk about the four-legged stool, but we're not going to go there.
I don't do Bitcoin. I don't talk about Bitcoin.
So I guess unless you feel there's something that is worth mentioning first, should we kind of dive into these kind of three components?
Sure. So the three components are light, water, and magnetism. And I do think light is the most important one to start off with, because it's the easiest one to recognize in our daily lives, and how it influences us at that quantum level.
Okay. So you've mentioned obviously natural light being the primary way that we can regulate the circadian rhythm. How can we move that conversation forward, I guess? Like, where do you want to go first to help people understand the role of light in human health?
I think it's important to recognize that not all light is created equal, and that light from the sun, it contains a lot of information for that clock in our brain and for other parts of our body as well. And so when we are in natural light, and when we actually allow it into our eyes, because sunglasses, right? That's the whole thing. Sunglasses are like putting a garbage bag over a plant and expecting that plant to get all that it needs. We know plants need light to thrive. We do too. So if we can be outside in the natural sunlight is really amazing, because it contains a blend of different colors that I liken to nutrients. Like, it's got a blend of nutrients, like a whole food as opposed to a processed food. And so if we were to shine just regular old sunlight through a prism, everyone would recognize the colors of the rainbow. And then outside of the colors of the rainbow, we also have a portion of sunlight called infrared. It's closer to the red, but it's a little outside the red. That's what we kind of are synonymous with heat. And then ultraviolet, which we hear a lot about. So we hear like the damaging ultraviolet light. And that's what the sun gives us. But the sun doesn't just shoot all those rays at us first thing in the morning. The sun kind of layers on the colors of the rainbow at us all day long. And then after the sun reaches its high point in the sky, it takes those colors away in a very systematic way. And each of those colors actually kind of does something biologically for our bodies. And if it's not us, it's another creature on this planet that, utilizes a certain color of the light. And so we get the colors in a certain way, they go away in a certain predictable way, day in and day out. And we can then sync up based on what goes into our eyes, different processes in the body. And it's especially those morning hours that are really key, it appears, for my circadian rhythm and for just optimizing my human function for the day, to get those morning frequencies into my eyes, because they do so much. So that's natural light, right? That's sunlight. We compare that to a light bulb or to a screen. These are so foreign because they oftentimes don't contain every color of the rainbow. They definitely never contain ultraviolet or infrared. Those are missing, and they never change. So this screen is giving my eyes the same color message all day long. Same with the light bulb, same with my phone screen. And that's a confusing thing to my brain, because my clock in my brain wants the variation and it's not getting it.
Perfect. And I think even down to, as you sort of talk about their human function and the fact that the early hours of that sunlight is sort of priming us, and that comes down to also how our skin is responding to that light, right?
100%. So yes, the skin can act like a secondary eye almost. So the same light receptors we have in our eyes, we have on our skin. We also have them on the surfaces of our gut and lung, because in utero, those tissues used to all be the same tissue before they kind of diversified their function. So it's fascinating to think that we've got light receptors in our gut and our lung tissue, but we do. And so, yeah, so the skin can matter too. And so like, if for those who aren't familiar with this term receptor, in the backs of our eyes, I liken it now this, so I'm American, right? And so I use a baseball analogy, but I think we can all picture, right? You know, like these little catcher's mitts, right? So like these little catcher's mitts waiting in the backs of the eyes, and literally light acts like a baseball or a ball, and it gets kind of shot into our eyes, if you will, in a way that we don't feel, but it gets shot into our eyes and it interacts with these mitts in the back of our eyes. And whatever, depending on the color of light, the color of a little baseball that gets shot out of the sun and caught by these mitts, that communicates a message to my brain. And the main one that my brain tunes into is the color blue. And so that's cool because there's no blue before sunrise. And then as the sun rises, the amount of blue light that the sun shoots at us gets higher and higher and more until the sun's at its high point. And then it goes away until after sunset, there's no blue either. So I literally have these little catcher's mitts waiting to catch those blue photons to tell my brain what time of day it is based on the amount of photons they catch.
Amazing. Okay, so with all of that in mind, we are saying that light is the primary regulator of circadian rhythm. But there's, with my limited understanding here, there's also, and going back to our sort of tripod chair, there's a nice intimate connection between light and water, for example. So do you want to kind of just touch on some of that as well?
Yeah, I do. And I could spend all day. This is my favorite thing that I've learned in quantum biology. And this is where the light bulb went off for me. It was like, wow, this is powerful stuff. So, you know, Alex, we hear, right, like the human body is 70% water, right? We hear that all the time. That's not something that's going to confuse everyone. Yes, we're made of water. If we're dehydrated, it impacts our cells. So we know that we are made of water and we need water. But what I don't think is really well appreciated, and it's just starting to become more and more accepted, although it's still, you know, there's still some people who think that this is fringe, even though it's the research has been around for 30 years, but the water inside of us is different. It's not like water in a glass, you know, it's not, it doesn't swirl around. It organizes itself inside of the cell and outside of the cell into like a gel consistency. So picture like a Jello, right? It's not a true liquid. And what they've found is that this water actually, it's very ordered. If you were to look at the patterning of how the water interacts with itself, like each other under a microscope, if you were to be able to look at the molecular level, it's very much structured like ice. And ice is a very, very ordered version of water. Liquid water is not. Liquid water is kind of the hydrogens and oxygens kind of slosh around back and forth. And so this is cool because the water inside of us is now considered like liquid crystal. So it's ordered like the ice in this very structured way, but it can still have some movement and some wiggling. It's still more of a liquid. And so it actually, we now know, because it takes on that special characteristic of a liquid crystal, it has so many cool properties that it uses to give our body health. So one of my prime examples, and this water is called EZ water, exclusion zone water. If anyone goes onto my page, they know I'm all gung-ho about EZ water. But what we know about this water is that it actually, it creates, as it forms naturally everywhere there's a biological surface. So picture a cell with a membrane. Let's go super basic. So the outside of the cell, let's picture the inside of the cell. Right next to that membrane, this really ordered gel water forms all the way around. And unlike water in a glass, which is called neutral, it has no charge, this water has a negative charge. And immediately next to that ordered water is a line of positive charge. And so what you have here now, anytime there's a negative next to a positive, that's a battery. Take a look at any battery in any device you have. You'll always see a positive end and a negative end, because you need those two separate charges for electrons and electricity to be able to flow. And so the coolest research that I have stumbled across, 5 years ago, was from Gerald Pollack's lab, who really is the prominent researcher when it comes to this type of water. And what he found was that if we take these tiny, tiny microelectrodes and we put one tiny little, basically a wire into the negative part and a little tiny wire into the positive part, it lit a light bulb. So that means inside of us, we've been taught that ATP is our only form of energy, and we only make that from food, and we have to eat to make energy. And what I'm telling people is that we also have a secondary, and actually I think this might be the primary mechanism, and the food ATP is the secondary mechanism. We actually, when we get sunlight into our skin, or onto our skin and into our bodies, we make a bigger battery. That water, actually, the negative part actually grows bigger, the positive part grows bigger. So basically we recharge this water battery inside of our bodies from infrared sunlight. And infrared happens to be a frequency that's there from sunrise all the way until sunset. So we've been given this beautiful opportunity to go outside and get this infrared light into our bodies to actually give us free energy.
Amazing.
Pretty wild.
That is wild. And again, it's like, I'm just thinking of all the different people that would benefit from understanding that, the obvious ones of chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia, but what you mentioned earlier as well, these light receptors in the guts, from like an embryology sort of perspective, it's just mind-blowing ultimately.
It's super mind-blowing to recognize that we really run on electricity, and we've been taught the chemical paradigm, which is where pharmaceuticals treat and supplements treat. And I'm not saying there's not a place for those things. I'm just saying we have to start recognizing that we're full of electricity. And that's what the quantum world really deals with. It's like the flow of electricity and the ability to manipulate the electrical component of our bodies. And when you recognize, it could be as simple as getting infrared sunlight on my body, and that wavelength actually penetrates 30 centimeters, so it can go into my body too. That's beautiful for people who are suffering from digestive issues, who only have a limited amount of food they feel like they could eat, and they think they need to, only get their energy that way. And they don't realize that, yes, you do extract nutrients from food, but while you're healing your gut, and while you're maybe feeling like you're on this really restricted nutrition plan, you have a secondary energy source that you need to maximize. And that's called getting your skin into the sun and really charging up that water battery.
Yeah. And some of the research on sort of certainly using sort of infrared light devices, both animal and human studies showing like how microbiome diversity improves, keystone species improve in quantity. We've got the evidence there as well that this isn't, as you say, fringe or quackery or anything like this.
Yeah, I think so. Photobiomodulation, this red light therapy, has been studied again 30 years plus. And we're seeing more and more benefits to it. And I really think, though, the overarching theme is that these panels contain infrared, typically two wavelengths of infrared light that coincide with, being able to soak them into our bodies and create that water network, that structured water network at a bigger rate. So that water battery charge is huge, because that battery energy can get donated to any process. So if we have some dysfunction in this part of our body, dysfunctional cells they lack charge. Every cell, again, not controversial, ask anyone who's ever studied, human physiology, every cell needs more electrons than protons. They need a net negative charge. And as that charge drains is when a cell starts to say, oh, I've got to start shutting down certain operations, just like a cell phone. Your battery gets to 4% and the screen dims, and you can't download a video anymore, and you can't, make, a long distance, like a call or whatever it might be. Like lots of functions start to shut down to preserve the cell phone usage. a cell, and besides not a mobile phone, but an actual cell does the same thing. It says, okay, what are Carrie's top priorities? Because we don't have enough energy to do everything she needs. So we're going to just do these few things. But we can only survive like that for so long before there's a dysfunction that starts to happen. And so what that cell is lacking is it's lacking energy and it's lacking electrons. And what we can do then is use the sunlight to just recharge those electrons so that that cell can now heal and that cell can thrive and do all the tasks that it needs to do.
Perfect. Okay. So if we were to summarize where we're at, we're saying that light is the master regulator of our 24-hour clock. It's the main stimuli. It comes in through primarily the eyes, but as you mentioned, the skin as well. Influences the SCN in the center of the brain, and that's sort of distributing messages to all our cells about what time of day it is and therefore what they should be doing, kind of physiologically speaking. We have mentioned sort of the spectrum of light and the rainbow, for example, which I love the idea of how it kind of mirrors kind of the dietary side of things. I love that kind of idea. And then we've spoken about how light is very much important as a way to charge the battery, which is where the water and the EZ water come into this piece as well.
Correct.
So that's sort of the light at the most simplistic level, obviously kind of covered, I imagine. Where does unless there's something else you want to go into first, Carrie, so please do say, where's the kind of the magnetism bit come into this?
The magnetism is an interesting one. And at some point, I do want to talk light at night, right? I know I think that's an important one to address for people. And it's an easy one for people to maybe manipulate in their lives to see an improvement in things like sleep, restorative sleep and stuff like that. But magnetism, again, if you were to look up, Earth's magnetic field, right? Do a quick search online for Earth's magnetic field, you would see that we've got a magnetic pole at the North Pole and the South Pole, and that we actually have like a magnetic field around the Earth that is formed because of how the lava flows like 20 miles down, like really deep down. We got these flows of lava that are just full of charged metals and things like nickel and iron. And anything that moves with a charge, this is physics, so you'll just have to trust me on this one if you want to, but actually never trust anyone on anything, look it up yourself, would be the flowing charge creates its own magnetic field. So that anything that has a charge and flows creates its own magnetic field. And we just happen to have a lot of lava down there that's flowing. And so we get this big magnetic field. And that magnetic field also works with the water in our body, because when our water is, when the water in our body is in a magnetic field, it orients itself a certain way. And so not only do we have this battery that is formed from the sunlight, but the magnetic field kind of helps direct it a little bit more. It's like almost as if I have a battery and it's not quite connected exactly how I want it inside of something. And then all of a sudden it just kind of snaps in place and now it can do its job. It's the same thing. The water reacts to the magnetic field, which is stronger at night than it is during the day. And so it kind of orients itself at night a certain way to allow for healing. It really helps to orient the water molecules, because at night when we sleep, we're supposed to be in this repair mode. And that's part of what the magnetic field of Earth does. But what's fascinating and kind of, I don't want to say worrisome, because I don't know if there's anything we can do about it, but the magnetic field of the Earth has been diminishing now over 4,000 plus years, right? We're getting into less and less magnetism at night. And so perhaps that's a reason why we're seeing more inflammatory issues that are not being healed at night, because we now know that the stronger the magnetic field, the more healing potential it has. So it's like we just so happen to be living in a time where the magnetic field is weakening. And that's also coinciding with a time where we're more exposed to things that could create inflammation than ever. So perhaps there's a correlation there that we're just need to maybe take that next extra step to help our body heal, because we're in this weakened magnetic field.
Okay. And do we know why that's happening? Is that kind of partly a man-made thing?
No, actually what they've done was they in the 80s, there was 5 countries that dug down really deep to kind of assess you can assess, how the magnetic field has changed over time based on the orientation of certain minerals, because minerals orient themselves too. And what they found is that every so often there's been 9 what they call pole reversals, which is what, basically a decrease of the magnetism to 0, and then the pole reverses itself, and there have been 9 of them, and each one is associated with a decent amount of fossils. And so that they've shifted. Clearly some species have survived through these things, right? But it's a period of change for organisms on the planet, and there is or an opportunity for these organisms to adapt to a change. And what they're finding is that this just typically happens where the flow the flow of lava and the magnetic field, it circulates in a way that it actually creates heat on the planet, and then that heat it weakens the ozone layer. The ozone layer gets bigger. We don't need to get controversial with climate stuff, but then what happens is you do have a period where the sun's magnetic field becomes way more powerful than the Earth's magnetic field, and that's where it's like a 0 point, where the sun has overpowered us. And then at some point, what happens is the lava actually starts flowing in a different way, and it helps to build the magnetic field back up, and then it starts back over again. You get a rebuild up of the atmosphere, all of the ionosphere, and then voila, everything kind of recharges itself. And that has happened 9 times in history. Listen, this is not my area of expertise. This is just me reading the research from other people, but it's been fascinating because there is definitely a pattern that they've discovered where something heats up, it changes parts of the atmosphere, and then things shift back to then a kind of a new era, if you will. And so that's what we're in. But here's the deal. I think scientists are saying we have 400 to 800 years before we start to approach the 0 point.
Okay.
So don't go out and panic. And clearly species survive through it. So yeah, that's where we're at right now.